If it wasn't for the Clash and their political sensibilities, punk would have just been a haircut and bondage trousers, and not a movement. For me, they were the last great music can change the world band, and London Calling was their zenith. One of Britain's most prolific political songwriters, Billy Bragg, said that in 2019. London Calling is a brilliant album. We know this, but you might not know, especially if you're only a casual fan of The Clash, just how important this album was, for a multitude of reasons. By the late 70s, punk rock was starting to feel like a parody of itself. What began as a raw political movement quickly turned into more of a fashion trend. Some great bands remained, of course, but many simply lost sight of what it meant to be punk. You've probably heard the famous line, "Punk died the day the Clash signed to CBS." That was said by Mark Perry of the magazine Sniffin' Glue, but I don't think it's fair to say that. I think it's more accurate to say that the Clash were moving away from a scene that had already lost its way. This had already started to happen with the band's second album, Give 'Em Enough Rope. CBS told them to produce a cleaner sound than their debut, and gave them producer Sandy Pearlman, who had worked with Blue Oyster Cult, to help with that. Their first album was proper punk, raw, lo-fi, and fast. Give 'Em Enough Rope was still punk, but polished. It was actually criticised for having a more mainstream sound, but still performed incredibly well, reaching number 2 in the UK. So with each album, the punk edge was gradually fading away. But their third album is when everything changed. It proved to them and the world that you didn't have to be strictly punk to be political. You could be experimental, you could be creative, and you could still talk about the problems of the world. It really did change everything. Amanda Petrusic of Pitchfork summed it up incredibly well. For those who came of age in the late 80s and early 90s, calling The Clash a punk band was, and remains, more a matter of effect than honesty. In 2004, wholly and completely divorced from a context that never fully resonated with a global audience, The Clash are a rock band, and 1979's London Calling is their creative apex. A booming, infallible tribute to throbbing guitars and spacious ideology. By the late 70s, punk was more specifically linked with rusted safety pins, shit-covered Doc Martens, and tight pink sneers than any steadfast, organised philosophy. The Clash insisted on forefronting their politics. This album tackles topical issues with impressive gusto. The band cocks their cowboy hats, assumes full outlaw position, and pillages the world market for sonic fodder and lyric-ready injustice. But I am getting ahead of myself slightly, so let's back up. After the release of their second album, Give 'Em Enough Rope, The Clash went through a bit of a rocky period. The Clash parted ways with their longtime manager, and their label was also beginning to lose interest. The band's debut album was initially withheld from the US, as it was seen as uncommercial. With their second album, CBS hoped to make a big impact in America, but it didn't quite connect the way they wanted it to, despite it performing well in the UK. Sales were modest compared to their hype, and they definitely weren't a money-making stadium act. On top of all this, the band's songwriters, Joe Strummer and Mick Jones, hadn't written material for over a year, possibly writer's block or possibly just too busy with touring. However, things started to look up again in early 1979. The Clash set out on a US tour with rock and roll legend Bo Diddley. And when they secured a new rehearsal space in Pimlico called Vanilla Studios, suddenly the creative floodgates opened. So much so that they soon had enough material for a double album. As usual, Mick Jones composed and arranged most of the songs, and Joe Strummer focused on the lyrics. While they were out on tour, they had absorbed the interesting music they heard, and began incorporating it into their own work. They reportedly worked 10 hours a day on this album, while bands like Blondie were finding success producing cross-genre tracks mixing punk rock and new wave and disco. The Clash was working in influences from reggae, blues, soul, rock and roll, ska, R&B, pop, rockabilly, jazz, as well as the punky stuff they were used to. They were definitely shaking off their punk origins and proving you could be political and talk about things that matter in any genre. Their skill as songwriters and musicians had also massively improved since their debut album, and they were really putting those skills to good use, tackling themes like conflict, unemployment, and social displacement. What they were producing was far more sophisticated than their punk peers around them. Whether or not they were outright abandoning punk with this record, or if they were actually injecting new life into the genre, is a debate still had today. Feel free to go at it in the comments. The band moved over to Wessex Studios in Highbury and brought on co-producer Guy Stevens. Now, CBS wasn't exactly a fan of Guy Stevens. He was known to have alcohol and drug issues and could be a bit unconventional. He would famously hurl chairs and ladders around in order to maintain a rock and roll atmosphere in the studio. He even poured a bottle of wine over a piano at one point because he thought it would make it sound better. It was Guy's way of injecting a certain atmosphere into the room. There were some strange moments. I remember one time looking into the control booth where the engineer and Guy were, and they were sort of wrestling over the desk. We couldn't quite figure out what was going on, so we stopped playing. We stopped playing and we went into the room to find out what was going on, and they were wrestling because Bill Price, the engineer, was trying to stop Guy from putting on a live record of Arsenal beating Manchester United live through the system while we were recording. Now, Salmon does credit Guy with being helpful in providing the energy needed in recording their tracks. Focusing on the title track for a moment, that song began life in a taxi ride Joe Strummer had with his then fiancée. There was a lot of Cold War nonsense going on, and we knew that London was susceptible to flooding. She told me to write something about that. Strummer was really tuned into the world news, and with Mick Jones, began writing a song about the impending doom of war and everything else that goes along with it. He did 2 or 3 drafts of lyrics that I then widened until the song became this warning about the doom of everyday life. It's a sort of dystopian news broadcast, basically listing all the things wrong with the world, like famine and drug addiction and nuclear meltdowns, so on and so on. The phrase London Calling comes from the BBC. That's the phrase they used during their broadcasts to Europe in World War II. The album was recorded over a 6-week period, after which the band headed off on another US tour. And it was on this tour that the famous photo of Paul Simonon was taken. The photo was taken during a gig in New York's Palladium. That venue was a seated venue, and the bouncers didn't allow the crowd to stand up. That frustrated me to the point that I destroyed this bass guitar. Unfortunately, you always sort of tend to destroy the things you love. The photo was taken by Penny Smith. Designer Ray Lowry then used the image to create one of the most iconic album covers of all time. Some say it symbolises the band's feelings towards the death of punk, or rock and roll in general. It's the destruction of an instrument, the death of music, especially when you view it as a bookend alongside Elvis Presley's debut album, of which London Calling was inspired. Elvis, the king of rock and roll, can be seen as the birth of this movement, which later spawned punk and the rest of it. He's on the cover there, holding a guitar, and then London Calling is a sort of statement from The Clash reflecting what they feel was the death of the movement, because the guitar is now being destroyed, albeit a bass guitar. And the original title for this album was The Last Testament as well, which of course is very fitting. The album was released in the UK in December 1979 and the US in January 1980. And to maybe prove they still had some punk DNA left in them, the double record was sold for the same price as a standard single album. And the album performed well, starting steady and then increasing after critical acclaim, shifting 2 million copies. And it performed well outside of the UK, despite its London-centric themes. It reached the top 20 in Australia, Canada and Austria, number 4 in Norway and number 2 in Sweden. But for me, the most important thing about this album isn't the sales and chart positions, it's the impact it had. It seriously changed the way people looked at punk and rock and roll. At the time, it was said of The Clash that they were the only band that mattered, and it really felt that way. The Clash were more than a punk band. They were much more musically adventurous, and London Calling was really the record where they incorporated music from around the world. And every song sounded like The Clash. The album was a revelation. It really made anything seem possible. Like you could play a reggae song, or a hard rock song. London Calling made me realise that there were bands out there who were willing to tell the truth, and in an unflinching, uncompromising way, where every note of music and every lyric mattered. That was brand new to me. That was written by Rage Against the Machine guitarist Tom Morello, and it just goes to show the influence this album had. When an album can be cited as an influence for both Billy Bragg and Rage Against the Machine, you then get an idea of just how far-reaching it is. Another band that was hugely influential in British rock was Slade, arguably the biggest band of the 70s. But their story is surprisingly tragic. I've taken a deep dive into them. You can click over there to watch that one next.